Hi, DIFESTers. My name is Reuben Vincent, and I am the founder of DIFEST Global. A warm welcome to you all on the third edition. This year, DIFEST will focus on the future of work by addressing authenticity, belongingness, and social impact as some of the most important practices for building a more inclusive and purpose driven workplace for everyone to thrive. Before we begin, I would like to humbly thank our belonging partner, Newsela, for supporting our initiative in democratizing world class content and promoting equity in education. On this note, I would like to welcome you to our session on driving equity in education to build the next generation of global leaders. Our moderator for today is the co founder and chief academic officer at Newsela. He leads the delivery of learning insights that power improvements in student outcomes by Newsela's products and services. He was previously the founding director of digital learning at Achievement First Public Charter Schools, where he spearheads the learning at Achievement, where he spearheads the integration of digital learning technologies across 22 schools, including flipped classrooms, mobile learning, and one-on-one computing. He began his education career in Teach for America and went on to teach in public and private schools as well as in the US Navy. He holds degrees from Wesleyan, Brown, and Tufts University. Please welcome Dan Cogan-Drew.
Thank you so much, Rudy. And it's a pleasure to be here. And Dr. Jenkins, it's wonderful to see you. And thank you for joining us. I was introduced briefly, but let me introduce you. You've been dedicated to serving the needs of students for over 30 years. You were named Superintendent for Orange County Public Schools in Florida in 2012. And you've spent the last decade leading one of the largest school systems in the United States with many great successes. You've received many recognitions as a notable leader nationally and been named Florida Superintendent of the Year by multiple entities and been a finalist for the national title. You're quite engaged in the community and served on several notable boards. So in the interest of getting to the conversation, I won't list all of your awards, but we're really privileged to have you in the conversation. And so I'd love to, the topic today is equity, and I'd love to dive in by connecting it briefly to some of our work at Newsela, and then I'd love to ask you how you connected when you're speaking as a leader to your team. So for us, equity is part of, we often say DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And we tie equity to our mission, which is meaningful classroom learning for every student. And equity ties notably to the every student portion of our mission. And I wonder, as you think about equity as a topic, as a leader, and as you're leading your teams, what other words do you associate it with? And how do you want your teams to think about equity in their work?
That's a good question, Dan. First, let me thank you for having me on as a speaker for the panel today. I think it's a critical topic. When we consider diversity and equity, inclusion, belonging in the K-12 sector, it's pretty similar to what you have described. And I think the way most parents and most adults would probably easiest relate to it is this notion that every child, when they come into school, feel welcome and respected. There has to be some notion of safety when they enter the school realm, regardless of their background. And I would go one step further. The notion of equity also implies that we are going to do something to level the playing field so that those who are disadvantaged have an equal opportunity to learn and grow and thrive.
And so that sort of leads to a follow-up question then, is that speaking about disadvantages and ensuring that there's equitable opportunity for every student, what are some of the obstacles that schools face in ensuring equitable access and equitable outcomes? What stands in the way, and how do you think of the school's role in removing those obstacles?
I think the clearest obstacle has to do with poverty. We just have to speak to the elephant in the room. when we have children who come to school with far fewer advantages at home, in fact, significant disadvantages at home, that is a huge impact on their ability to learn and to grow and to excel in school. And something has to be done to help give them an opportunity to learn. If anyone pretends that there are no differences based on socioeconomic background, they are just not being forthright. And quite frankly, it's just dishonest to imply that there are not significant differences impacted by poverty.
So it's really a central concern, and a school can't necessarily address the financial standing of a family, but there's an obligation as a public entity to work with every child from all homes and all socioeconomic statuses. In the current environment, I'd love to just sort of get right to it. Like a lot of us who are based in the United States, who have been following news and knowing that we're in an election year and approaching an election just next month, we know that there are concerns that the districts are addressing when their families that they serve are sending their children to school. And I wonder if you could just talk to us a little bit about the role that you see a district and district leadership playing in sort of helping families accept the agreements that they enter into when they send their children to public school, and where the lines are between what it means when the child leaves their home, what is the sphere of influence that the parent has at home, and how does that intersect with the responsibilities of the school, and how does that play out? In an election year, it's playing out in many ways that we could get into, but maybe at a high level, how do you think about that agreement that you're asking families to enter into?
So I think schools really are essentially asking parents to be partners, to help their child achieve an educational career that is going to prepare them for life, for a future, for career, for living in this world as a responsible citizen. And so there has to be a partnership with parents. And somehow we've gotten to this level of distrust or accusation almost around how noble those intentions are. So public education design, in my belief, and I believe in most people's belief, is really trying to develop young people into responsible citizens. And so it's not for brainwashing or indoctrination. It's really about teaching them to think for themselves, to be critical thinkers, and to certainly have all of the skills necessary to be a functioning adult. And then, of course, when they leave 12th grade, we want them to leave us ready for a career and a life that is certainly going to be pleasing in their needs as well as in those needs of society. So I think where we cross hairs lately is this notion that parents need to have more say in the curriculum. The truth is the curriculum, the standards are set at the state level, and then schools need to be very specific on how they implement those standards. And so I think it's every parent's right to say, I'd like to see what's being taught. It's posted on most websites. Here are the standards, what every child ought to know and be able to do in this particular grade level. Parents can also say, I would love to come and visit from time to time, as long as it's arranged and there are agreements with teacher unions. That is certainly agreeable as well. Where we tip the scale sometimes, Dan, and get a little bit out of kilter is this notion that there has to be a daily monitoring or a pre-monitoring even of every lesson plan. We've heard notions along those lines. That's probably going a bit too far. There has to be a reasonable partnership and awareness of the standards and some trust that the school is going to teach those standards as the state has set in place. Where we got offline there, it's hard to say, but we've sort of tracked along this notion of perhaps teachers can't be trusted, or there might be brainwashing going on, and that is just not the case.
And the concerns that are arising in board meetings, or that families are bringing forward, this request to inspect plans, this request to have a greater transparency. Where's that coming from? As you mentioned the word trust, do you think that that's the dynamic in trust has changed between families and their schools recently? And what would you attribute it to, if so, or what other explanation do you think?
I suspect a lot of it comes from the realm of social media and the spreading of rumors and quite often myths that simply have no relevance or reality. If parents are encouraged to be fearful, and I have no other way of describing it. Sometimes it feels like fear mongering. Be careful. This is going to happen. That is going to happen. Most parents, research in the past has shown that most parents are pretty pleased with their local school. But when they hear this ranting around public education, they think everyone else's school may be brainwashing children. And so I think social media has played into it. I think political dialogue has played into it. Sometimes intentionally, and perhaps sometimes they believe it's actually authentic, some of those allegations, but it's misleading, and parents, I think, sometimes react out of fear, and I can understand that.
And how does that affect the work and the mission of the district as it's trying to serve every student and the mission of equity that we started with? What's the impact of this kind of climate and this sort of, if there is in fact an erosion of trust? How does that impact a classroom?
See, I think I want to stick with the fear factor because I don't want to say specifically it's an erosion of trust, but this notion that people are fearful because of what they're hearing. I think it has a couple of different impacts, Dan. Number one, it creates a harshness towards diversity that already exists within our schools. And so if I have young people who have gender decisions that they are struggling with or dealing with, and the adults are not sensitive to those children, we already know that my LGBTQ community, those youngsters are at high risk of having additional emotional needs and risk and concerns regarding their health. And so all I want is for each child when they come to school, no matter what their gender identity is or any other ethnic or racial identification, I want them to feel safe when they come to school, that they will be respected, that they will be protected, and that they can expect that they will be regarded in the curriculum and in literature that they read. I agree that parents have a right to say, I don't want my children exposed to certain books, but in some instances, they can't say, I don't want anybody in the school to be exposed to certain books where Johnny and Susie have two moms, for example, because those children are in our schools. And so a parent can say, I don't want my child checking out this kind of book. I don't want this kind of material for my child, but they can't say nobody in the school can have exposure to the book about those children having two mommies because the children exist in our schools. And so I think there has to be a balance somehow, Dan, between parents' preferences for their individual children and partnering with the school on what they can actually check out of the library or be exposed to without going to the extreme of needing to ban anything that does not represent a particular child and his or her family, as opposed to John and Tammy who have two mommies. Let's not at least make it something that's not available to other children in the school. There has to be a balance. And then public education is one choice. Folks may certainly choose other means of educating their children, anything from private school to parochial school to homeschooling, if they want greater levels of control. But in the public sector, there has to be a balance so that all children feel represented and feel protected and safe in that school setting.
Yeah, it certainly raises the question and the dynamic here of a sort of zero-sum game of if there isn't a way, why can't there be a way for everyone to feel a sense of belonging and for us to reach every child equitably, and that there isn't a sense that if one child feels a sense of belonging, another doesn't, and that there's equity for some, but somehow if we skew towards one, we're losing others along the way. And I'm not quite sure where that notion has been introduced, but it certainly seems to be pervasive that there's a sensitivity that if this is going to be discussed, I can't have my child hearing it, and I can't have any child hearing it. And I guess one of the concerns, as you mentioned, that the parents have a right, they can send their children, if they have the means, they can send their children to other institutions where they can be educated. In a world where everyone makes that decision, I worry about the erosion of public education and the impact that that has on the larger goals towards powering and supporting a democratic society. I wonder what your reflections are on that. I mean, how do we move away from the zero-sum game mentality, while acknowledging that every parent wants this for their child, and that is, such a thing is possible. We can have classrooms where every child feels a sense of belonging and equity.
So I think we learned a few things during the pandemic, actually, Dan. I'm glad you raised that issue. And first, let me also clarify, I am not advocating for any kind of instruction around gender identity. I think every school should stick to their state standards, which do not have a provision for such explicit instruction. That would never be my concern. I think teachers need to be mindful, but I do think curriculum and materials can, in some instances, reflect the diversity of the students that we serve, and then parents can certainly make choices when they want and don't want their children to have exposure to particular items such as library books. I think we learned something from the pandemic, however, when every parent had to go through being a home instructor. By and large, vast numbers returned to public education as soon as it was available, because home instruction is not easy. You ask any parent who actually does homeschooling, it is very challenging work. And the older the children get, the more diverse the curriculum and the more challenging that work would be for any parent. And so I think public education, 90%, the vast majority, I would say 2/3 across this nation are in the public K-12 sector, because that is where most children have their needs served. If you narrow the focus of where your child receives their educational needs, you also narrow some of those extracurricular opportunities as well. So the vast majority of the public will depend on a public K-12 system to serve the needs of their children. In Florida and in other states as well, parents can make a choice with vouchers and go to a private or parochial school, or to do a certain level of homeschooling. And I respect every parent's right to make that choice. I think public education has to compete and has to market what they have to offer in comparison to other entities, and keep their customers coming back because they offer what their children need.
Mm-hmm. I want to acknowledge we have an audience, and I would love to field questions or comments that you have as you're listening in on this conversation, whether you're joining from the United States or abroad, whether these issues are familiar to you because you understand politics of Florida, politics happening in the United States because of being an election year, or whether you're joining us from overseas and some of this may be new, or you want to localize this to your own context. Curious to know how the implications of this kind of debate and conversation that the United States is clearly wrestling with play out in your home situation. So thinking about your role as a leader, and thinking about the themes of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. We've been talking about areas where these can be sensitive, where this can be a difficult topic. Can you talk to us a little bit about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging as a strength, and as a place to build from, and not always to be, let's say, sometimes we can feel defensive, we can feel like we have to justify, but how does it fuel advances in the work of your schools and in your life as an educator?
I can think of a perfect example, Dan, where what was once thought of as a deficit is now celebrated and lauded as an opportunity. When we had children who did not have English as their original language, they were English language learners. It used to be probably considered a deficit, got to get them proficient in English as quickly as possible. And now it is lauded, bilingualism is lauded and celebrated in districts where you can get a bilingual graduation diploma because you are fluent in both languages, or in more than two languages, actually. And outside of the U.S. and other countries, that is the norm, that young people have more than one language that they are fluent and literate in. And so our ELL population, who have had a history of struggling to achieve in schools in the U.S., now have an advantage of being bilingual, and the notion of dual language is actually celebrated rather than considered a deficit. And I think it's again, some of this is based on the politics in our country that sort of went off the rails around this notion of equity and helping those who are marginalized to have an equal chance, to have a chance at the promise of the American dream. And so in years past, nobody would have thought twice about equity initiatives to level the playing field. Johnny and Susan are both trying to reach an item on the shelf. Johnny needs a step ladder. Susie needs to tiptoe. But Barbara may actually need an actual extension ladder because her height is of such, if she's going to reach that same level, she needs some additional support. And so the American way supports this notion of helping everyone be able to achieve their dreams and to be successful. And somehow there's been a bit of a backlash around the word equity and whether or not there ought to be additional opportunities or supports provided for those who are disadvantaged. And I would submit to anyone, for the children who come from homes in poverty, it is not their fault. They didn't ask to be born in the particular household. And I think it is part of our democracy to offer them support and assistance to help them be successful. The term equity should not be frowned upon as it has been of late for some reason. It's the American way of helping those who don't have their own opportunities, giving them some assistance so that they can achieve success in the American dream.
That's right. And to belong, ultimately feel that they belong in our society, belong in our classrooms. I think that's something that we often frame belonging in a sense as a sort of a static state, something that is persistent, and when in fact it's really dynamic. That is, the same person can belong and feel a sense of belonging in one setting in their home. They can travel to school and suddenly feel that sense of belonging disappear in the first period, and then in the second period feel it resurge as they have a strong bond with their classmates, with their teacher, and then have it immediately disappear once again in the third. And it's a very distracting, to say the least, for a student to feel that sense of belonging ebbing and flowing as we might in the workplace when we show up into a meeting where we're not really sure why we were invited, but we know we have to be there. And we wonder constantly whether this is the right meeting for us, what's our responsibility. It's very hard to focus on the content of the meeting. It's very hard to focus on the content of the lesson if we're concerned, as we might be, about whether are we in the right room? This doesn't seem to be pertinent to us. And I think that's something that is more a human quality than it is particular to schools. Though schools certainly experience this in some magnitude.
And you know what, Dan, our young people can be such a wonderful lesson to the adults, because I think my youth get it. They are more apt to be accepting and celebratory around diversity that is around them. A little bit of nudging on their part, and it is not hard for them to be accepting and encouraging of one another. I can give you example after example where some of my students, two of my students with Down syndrome, ESE special education students, their entire student body got behind them and insisted that they be homecoming king and queen. Other instances, I have gay straight alliance clubs in all of my high schools where children from the LGBTQ community are receiving additional support from students who are straight. They get it, and they are usually very accommodating and very caring about each other. When we have board meetings periodically, when folks show up with different opinions, they are the adults who have very strong opinions about who should be accepted and what should be accepted and acknowledged in the school setting. But I think our young people, I'm encouraged for the future of this country because I see young people that get it, that are very dedicated to diversity and inclusion and equity.
Well, and your comments there resonate with a question that we received from a listener named Dessa, who, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, asking whether children's feelings about DEIB have shifted with the misinformation alongside parents, or if they're more open-minded. I guess stepping back, like, have you seen students' attitudes change in the last, say, 3 to 5 years, or a more pronounced outreach or overt attempts, like you were talking about, public public outreach, gestures about being homecoming king and queen. Are they reacting in more noticeable ways?
I see my students being more accepting. I am not concerned about student behavior around these issues at all. One or two outliers might take place from time to time, but by and large, I think our children are very accepting of diversity and inclusion because it's what they've grown up with. When we see adults, quite often, and sometimes, Dan, I'll be honest with you, they may just have particular political opinions, and so they come and make their voices heard. And sometimes they may not actually have children that are in the school system, but they have this deep concern. And sometimes I think it goes back to fear mongering, that they need to come and speak out because they're afraid there may be some kind of brainwashing going on. There was one term someone used that was I thought was totally inappropriate, that they were schools are turning little boys into little girls. That is going to gender fear. That stirs up fear and hard feelings and strife, and I think nothing could be further from the truth. But when someone stirred it with that kind of fear and they feel the need to come and speak out about it, you can understand it. It generates from misinformation and from fear. I don't see that happening with our young people. It's with our adults from time to time that we think that misinformation gets out there.
Yeah, and there is a certain distance that some adults have from the life of school if they're not educators themselves. It's been some time since they were in the system. They may not even have children themselves in the school system, and so they're speaking about things at a level of abstraction, which, in our experience, and it may be true for you as well, is that when we get specific about what this actually looks like, let's take a look at the standard, or let's take a look at what students are being asked to read, and we get specific. The objections tend to sort of thin out and dissipate because they are sort of ginned up a little bit more in the abstract than in the concrete.
Absolutely. And when we say, let us step outside with you and show you what our standards are, if you're aware of something different taking place, certainly let us know. But here is what we instruct and here's what's required. And we give them that reassurance. Most times they are reasonable. And I want to be very clear too, Dan. I don't mind that a grandparent or a senior citizen wants to speak up about what's being taught in our schools. I think they should be concerned in general about our young people and about the citizenry. I would love for them to come and volunteer and be a part of the school. They are absolutely welcome. If they have misinformation, we'd like to at least be given an opportunity to correct it, but everyone is welcome to help. There's enough work for everyone to help educate our children. The issue is around how authentic your information is that you bring to that volunteering or to the podium to speak about. We just have to be upfront about that.
Yep. When we were preparing for this conversation, we had a couple of exchanges around something that I was thinking of as referencing a curriculum from an organization called Facing History, which is came out of response to the Holocaust during World War II, and coins an expression that they refer to as the universe of obligation, which is essentially, as I think of it, is the sort of how far does your circle extend outward from you, the concentric circles of you in society, you and your family, your extended family, onto your community, down your block, and to the larger town or city, even to the country. And even in a sort of basic level, if you're walking past someone on the street and they trip and fall, will you help them up? And at what point do people stop recognizing that you should just help someone up when they fall, because it isn't universal? And I wonder if you could just talk to us a little bit about, as a leader of one of the largest districts in the country with influence over how children come to school every day and how educators receive them, how do you think about universe of obligation? What do we owe each other as citizens, as neighbors, beyond, let's say, our family that we might take for granted? You would always help your mother up if she fell. What if you encounter someone you haven't met, or a friend that you haven't met yet, as a teacher might say, on the first day of class? How do you want children to be received? How do you want educators to think about those kinds of obligations that we have to each other, and schools as that kind of microcosm of community?
See, I think we have an opportunity, and that's part of the core of what public education ought to be like in this country. Spoke to it a little bit earlier. Public education is a linchpin in our democracy. So an informed citizenry, number one, is going to be critical so that they are not misled, brainwashed, taken advantage of by what they see and hear, but they become critical thinkers and responsible citizens. And part of the responsibility of citizenship is this notion of empathy and caring for others. And so I think in our school setting, we have an obligation and a wonderful opportunity to teach children to care about others. And that sense of empathy, of understanding, of inclusion is absolutely a part of the DEI work that's expected in public education. And I think it's critical for our country. If we can at least give them a good dose of what it means to understand the shoes that someone else walks in and to have some empathy toward those individuals, we can give children a good foundation in that. I think we help produce a citizenry that will be caring, that understands their neighbor is beyond the person right next door. If someone falls, if someone's hurting, the notion of charitable giving to help those who are in need. Our schools wrap their arms around disaster relief and let's raise money, let's send shoes, let's send clothing to Haiti where there's been a terrible disaster, or to the Panhandle where there's been a hurricane. That kind of teaching and encouraging can be the hub of our school setting as well. And it's teaching our children to care. I don't know any plainer way to put it than to care about humanity at large. Save our earth, help those who are hungry, let's help those who have medical issues and those who can't afford enough food to eat. Those kind of issues are central in what we are doing in schools that help our children grow up to be responsible citizens.
So I'd love to just talk for a minute about the role that instructional materials play in that, because as you mentioned, learning about others and learning about their experiences. There are those who are close enough to us that if we live in Florida, we may know people who are personally affected by recent hurricanes. And that may be upfront and in our consciousness. How would you like educators to think about resources like the internet and the proper way to invite that into your classroom? What doesn't make it into your classroom? How would you know the difference? With that objective in mind, of learning about others, learning about things that you don't know about.
So the internet can be both a blessing and a curse. The vast knowledge at the fingertips of our young people is just mind-boggling, for lack of a better term, because what we used to have to look at an encyclopedia to find, and go to the library and use a card catalog, talk to people nowadays, our young people would say, what's a card catalog? And pretty soon they may say, what's a library? Because there are no encyclopedias that they need to go to look up information. So the on-time information that children are exposed to is incredible. That much information being at their fingertips is impressive. And it's certainly something that didn't exist when I was growing up. So I think that's the blessing. Our young people have a vast array of knowledge that is at their fingertips and available to them. Here's a curse. Among that vast accumulation of information is a lot of falsehood. And what we have to be careful about is that our young people know how to be critical thinkers and problem solvers who gather information, but who also know how to curate information that they might see on the internet. That is so critical. Dan, otherwise, why do we have to have an argument now again around whether or not the earth is flat? If it starts on the internet, people think it must be true. And so we've got to have our young people both take advantage of this wonderful opportunity called the internet, but also be very careful consumers who will be critical thinkers, who will curate that vast information that is available to them so that they put aside things that just aren't true. And I think that has to be something that both parents and schools will need to guard against. If it's on the internet, it doesn't mean that it's true. We've got to help our young people around that. I wouldn't go back to the encyclopedia. I want them to have this. There is no going back. You're not going to close Pandora's box at this point. But I want them to have that access but I need them to be critical thinkers who will not easily be misled by someone who puts a hoax on the internet or intentional misleading information. We've got to teach our young people to be critical thinkers and to really disaggregate what they might find on the internet.
Yeah, yeah, and you're speaking to that there is no going back. This is the world that we live in, and that we can't block this out, right? So that it's, I think, a sort of an impossible task to expect anyone to sort of filter all information such that only one type, whatever you might say, one type of information reaches students. The fact is that it's all in some form or another, it's going to reach them, and the question will be, how will they respond? What sense will they make of it? What tools do they have to interpret the signal from the noise, the truth from the fiction?
Absolutely. And let me mention, when it comes to the school setting, every teacher is not just left to their own devices to try to figure out the curriculum. That is not the case. In every school district, there's usually a central office that curates some of the curriculum information. They've got to meet the state standards, and then they have to go through some kind of curation to make sure they're not just using information haphazardly off of the internet. Can a teacher do that on their own if they desire? Probably, but that's not going to get them the best evaluation when it comes to how they're instructing their children. And I will tell you, I believe our teachers want to teach accurate and important information and stick to the standards that are approved by the state, because that's how they're judged at the end of the day. Students are tested on those standards.
Yeah, yeah. And I think this is something that the closer you get to schools, the more you understand and the more you sort of see how the process works. The farther you are, the more contrived your notions can become, and the more susceptible you are to misinformation about schools themselves, let alone misinformation about what reaches students and how instruction
And you know what? I love that point. And here's how we know that we've sort of had this glitch, because I think we have a generation that's gotten through K-12 that now depend on the internet for their information and sometimes seem to be misled. And so I wonder, it's always easy to see very clearly looking in the rearview mirror. I wonder if when the internet became all the craze and that first generation of students that were graduating, if we gave them enough tools to say, everything on the internet is not true. Let's at least be reasonable here. Because I've had adults actually share with me information that they found on the internet. Surely it's true because it's on the internet, and it's just ludicrous that people can be so easily misled. We've got to have some mechanism for teaching the citizenry at large. Here's how you differentiate. Can't depend on Facebook and others to make sure everything that's provided to you is accurate. Here's how you make sure you are curating your own information and watching your diet on what you read on the internet.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well said. So as we're starting to close out, welcome any other comments or questions from our audience. I'd love to put to you, as you look ahead, one thing that gives you hope and one thing that concerns you, that you see work still to be done. It's you sort of sitting where you are, you have a vantage point over the landscape of education in Florida, obviously in Orange County, across the country. What's one thing that, why don't we start with maybe the cloudier picture and then the sunnier one to follow? What's something that concerns you these days?
So, a couple of things come to mind, Dan. I am concerned at any efforts that seem harmful to my students and their particular needs. I am deeply concerned at some efforts that seem intentionally harmful for LGBTQ students and questioning students as well. I am deeply concerned that adult efforts around that may be politically motivated can be harmful to young people. I think we have to be extremely careful. When I know suicide rate among that particular population are higher than any other population, I want to guard them against this adult bickering around certain issues that will impact them. But that is concerning to me. Secondly, I'm certainly concerned over achievement gaps that just we have not overcome in the years past But while we may have been gaining on them, then pandemic comes along and it exacerbates those gaps through the digital divide as well. So I'm concerned that that we have to do enough to really narrow and close some of those opportunity gaps for our young people. We cannot discount what poverty does in certain households, cannot discount that Johnny's family doesn't have high-speed internet at home. Even if I give him a laptop, he's got to have some additional assistance if he's going to have the same opportunity as Roberto, who's going home with high-speed internet, as well as other resources in the home. We have to continue to make efforts toward equity for those children who come from disadvantaged backgrounds.
I want to, I know I asked you, I want to hear the sunnier side as well, but I want to just remark on something that you were talking about there in terms of student identity, something that we think about a lot when we're curating the materials that we're searching for that we think may be helpful for schools, is that there are issues around which we believe that it is helpful to frame a pro-con or a this or that kind of a point of view so that students can judge this. But identity is not one. There are not two sides. There's not a pro-con to a person, a child's identity. Every child belongs, and that is an absolute truth from which we proceed. And I think we're in an environment that's deeply disturbing to us where it does feel like it's zero sum. It does feel like if we're going to say that someone belongs, then someone else it somehow can't belong as well. And that part of this may also come, we talked about fear earlier, I'm afraid that I won't belong, and that it comes down to an innate human a need for belonging. And whenever that is under threat, we see that sort of fear mongering, we see that exclusionary behavior. We see that sort of need to draw a line and say us and them, because we become territorial, we become defensive, we sort of retreat. That kind of lizard brain is activated, and it becomes this primal fear. And that once activated can motivate people to behave in ways that they wouldn't otherwise. And it's almost a daily battle that we have to fight to overcome that, because we will retreat into ourselves and away from others and away from the communities progressively into smaller and smaller, inner sanctums where the only people we'll talk to are, the 5 or 6 people we live with. And that's not a democracy, and that's not a society for all. So,
and if you trace over the years, Dan, that's what's happened over the generations. When some different group appeared on our shores, there was discrimination and there was mistreatment, mostly based on fear and misinformation.
And we're a nation of immigrants, and generations of immigrants have wanted to belong. And when they felt a sense of belonging, they've turned that back against others. And
the next group.
The next group, because if you don't belong, then I do, and if I do, then you don't. So in the minute that we have left, I want to give you a moment what are some sunny spots, something that inspires you?
I think I am most encouraged. I told you this before. When you deal with our young people, they will lighten your heart. They will bring a smile to your face because you realize someday they're going to be in charge and they get it. I am most thrilled when I talk with my student advisory council, those high school students who are looking to make a difference in the world as they get ready to launch off into college and career. It is invigorating to me that our young people have not been somehow tainted or damaged by some of the dialogue that's going on among the adults in the last few years. I see such hope and such encouragement. And I have to say, it doesn't matter sometimes what their parents' preferences might be. Quite often, they diverge from that because they are independent thinkers. So we can teach them to be critical thinkers, to be problem solvers, and to care about individuals as individuals, and agreeing that everyone should be respected and included. I think we still have a bright future. I think our nation has a bump to get over that hopefully will be turning soon. It's unfortunate that we went down that path because I thought we were so much further down the road around this notion of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think we will see a recovery, and I'm encouraged because of our young people. And again, I encourage parents to take part in their schools if they have concerns, volunteer and get engaged. And I absolutely believe parents can choose what they want their children to be exposed to in the media center, for example, without insisting that nobody else's child can read a story, a book about children having two mommies, because that's reality for some of our babies, and they need to be able to read that book. So as long as you don't try to ban it for everybody, I agree that parents have have that right and that authority over their own children. Our future is bright, though, because of our young people and incredible adults that work with them, teachers, counselors, principals, and central office. They do phenomenal work on behalf of our young people. And I think we have K-12 education still has a bright future.
Well, Dr. Jenkins, I very much appreciate those words, and I would venture to say that I won't name the number of decades, but some number of decades ago, people were saying the same about us when we were the children and we are now the adults, that we had a bright future and we brought that forward, and a little bit at a time we improve. And the closer we get to schools, the better we understand them, the better we can support them and respect the work that they do. So thank you so much for taking time and sharing your thoughts and experience with us today. And I think we're gonna end on that note, though I'm not exactly sure how we're going out. So I might leave that.
It's been a pleasure, Dan. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much.
Hi, DIFESTers. My name is Reuben and I am the founder of DIFEST Global. A warm welcome to you all on the third edition. This year, DIFEST will focus on the future of work by addressing authenticity, belongingness, and social impact as some of the most important practices for building a more inclusive and purpose-driven workplace for everyone to thrive. Before we begin, I would like to humbly thank our belonging partner, Newsela, for supporting our initiative in democratizing world-class content and promoting equity in education. On this note, I would like to welcome you to our session on Is Neurodiversity a Competitive Advantage, especially among Gen Z and Millennials? Our moderator for today is a global future of work and inclusive talent strategy thought leader with extensive experience in global diversity and neurodiversity. She is a professor at Vanguard University of Southern California's graduate program in industrial organizational psychology. She writes for Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, Psychology Today, and SHRM blogs, and serves as the editor of the upcoming book, Evidence-Based Organizational Practices for Diversity, Inclusion, Belonging, and Equity. Please welcome Ludmila Praslova.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for this kind introduction. And I'm also thrilled to be here in this fantastic company. So I really look forward to this conversation, in part because we have such interesting guests, and I would love to pick your brains. So Rudy, thank you for introducing me. And I just wanted to say that I am one of those late diagnosed autistic people. I had very interesting career in academia and in writing. And then I discovered I was autistic in my 40s. And then I decided to solve the autism employment paradox, because we have so many talent and creativity and wonderful ability to contribute in the workplace, but the unemployment rate is absolutely shocking, up to 85% in US among autistic people with college degrees. So that's kind of my mission, and that's what I want to see obviously improve in this generation and in the current and in the future generations. I want those talents to be welcomed and appreciated. And I know that Lara and Reuben contribute a lot in their different ways to improving the world and making it a better place for all kinds of people. But I would love to hear from you. What is your journey, and what is your perspective and passion in this particular area? Let's start with Lara.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Lara Schaeffer, and my journey to discovering my own autism began because my daughter was diagnosed not till 15 years old. So that is a late diagnosis in itself. So she had to make her way through elementary school, middle school, and partly through high school, not aware of what was causing her experience of the world to be challenging sometimes, and that simply having the knowledge that the world is experienced by an autistic person differently, simply having that knowledge helps so much. So she was diagnosed at 15. My priority then was getting her settled, comfortable, happy. College applications were on their way. But once all of that settled in, I pretty much knew I had raised my daughter as a single mother. If she's autistic, I'm autistic, because our experiences of the world, the way we interact with the world, we're just so similar. So I honestly wasn't that interested in getting a formal evaluation until I started really thinking about things and becoming more and more, frankly, angry that it took so long to get my daughter diagnosed, that I lived till 45 years old, not having a clue that there was something different about me, when there is something very different about me. And it makes living in a world where others don't have that difference quite challenging. And so I knew I needed to get into advocacy. I knew I needed to try what I could do to make a difference. And I knew that having a formal evaluation, and as it worked out, getting diagnosed as autistic would be important in that aim.
Thank you. And then I know you also became very active and in trying to improve the lives of others. I hope to hear about that. But I also would love to hear about Reuben's personal journey, because you've done all kinds of interesting and creative things. So you're representing younger generations, but you just have very interesting personal experience. You started your company very young. You've done all kinds of interesting things.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Reuben Selby. I am the founder and CEO of a startup called Contact. Can you hear me okay?
Okay, I think a little up on your volume would help.
Let's see.
It might be backstage something.
Sorry. I run a tech startup called Contact, which is really about empowering creative people to find work and be discovered and be paid fairly for that work. But I also have my fingers in like many different pies. So one thing that I do alongside Contact is I have a fashion label and brand, and that's very much like my space for like self-expression. And yeah, I was diagnosed like quite late with autism. So I was 18 at the time. It took me a long time to kind of realize that I was like neurologically different to other people. I always kind of got the sense that I perceived the world in a different way, but I was always caught in the thought process of, doesn't everybody perceive the world in a different way? So it was really hard to kind of justify, you know, what made me so different to everybody else. So it was really, you know, it was quite a long journey to discovery. And I think the kind of like biases or stereotypes that I consumed, you know, early on without even knowing it probably affected my late diagnosis, just because I would maybe look or hear things which, you know, whether it's like through the media or through just like other social groups, I would kind of, you know, pick up these things, and then say if I were to see a neurodiverse person portrayed, you know, my initial instinct would be, oh, that's not me. But that just kind of shows how, you know, how kind of like badly or, you know, yeah, like misrepresented neurodiverse people are portrayed.
Absolutely. It's such a major problem that media portrays very narrow and very distorted image of various types of neurodiversity. And that's why we'll talk about those stereotypes, because they definitely delay diagnosis, prevent diagnosis for many people, and really cause all kinds of issues for us individually, and then for entire groups of people that are influenced by those stereotypes. So I'm kind of glad you mentioned right off the bat all those different ideas that sometimes we're just not even able to recognize what neurodiversity means, and what does it mean for individuals, and what does it mean for their contributions to society. So let's just start with the title of this session. We are talking about neurodiversity advantage, and that is another thing that I think is pretty influenced by stereotypes and misconceptions, because whenever I see it in business context, it's neurodiversity advantage for organizations hire specifically autistic people traditionally, because they are so incredibly productive and it will help your business. Okay, fantastic. But sometimes in practice, it translates into long hours, it translates into underpayment that has nowhere near compensating for productivity. So sometimes I'm wondering, okay, neurodiversity advantage for whom, and who is getting taken advantage of? So kind of a tricky question here. What do you think, when we throw around the terms like neurodiversity advantage, what do we mean, and how can we be more careful with it and more intentional? Let's start with Lara.
Well, I look at the term very purely that there are advantages associated with neurodiversity. Neurodiverse people, autistic people, we do see things differently. Reuben referred to it, I wrote it down. We perceive the world in a different way. We experience the world in a different way. And this allows us to draw new connections. And our world has so many large interlocking problems right now. If we continue to try to address these problems with the same people in the same way, nothing is going to change. I've been a teacher for 28 years, and there's a really predictable result that happens when a certain criteria is changed. When we do group work or small group discussions, if the students pair up with people that they choose, a certain level of quality results. But if I mix up the groups, if I assign the groups, if the groups are random, so that the students are not with the people they're most comfortable with. I didn't even know what canteen culture was, but that's when a whole organization starts to think the same way and value the same things. And so when you're just with your friends, maybe they'll still stay on task and answer the questions. But when you're with someone that you wouldn't have chosen, the inevitable result in the classroom, which I think is a pretty good experiment, is that higher level results are achieved because you're not just comfortable and you're stretching yourself more. And I think the neurodiversity advantage is something that should be seen to be brought to a neurotypical setting. And when this collective power is combined, that's when I think we can really accomplish something.
And taking us out of comfort zone and increasing overall productivity of our groups. That makes a lot of sense. Now, Reuben, what do you think is an important aspect of understanding neurodiversity advantage?
Yeah, I think that, you know, in some ways, I think that the term could be perceived as sensitive. In the, yeah, like you said, I think that the way that you know, autistic people specifically, you know, high functioning autistic people, you know, I think that maybe they end up getting the, you know, the kind of the spotlight on, you know, what it means to kind of be like a really high performer at, like, you know, normally for autistic people, an area of like specific, you know, knowledge and expertise. And I think that, yeah, it's like, I think that, you know, the way that I wouldn't want to be perceived if I were to, you know, be joining a new business, like in a way that like my neurodiversity is going to be as a tool to leverage like business success. So I guess, you know, I think that the term itself is like, it you know, kind of as Lara said, if you take it literal, and the way that I like to look at it is like, if I take a step back, it's really about like inclusivity and diversity of thought for me. So rather than, you know, I guess the thing which like I struggle with is that, you know, I wouldn't want like you know, CEOs and leaders to sit down and think, okay, you know, this is how we're going to approach diversity, and we're going to specifically, you know, bring on autistic people like directly because, you know, the number one reason is about productivity, because really it takes so much more thought and care to provide a space that actually allows autistic people to thrive. And I think that that's the first thing which like business owners should be thinking of, is actually how do we create that environment first, rather than thinking about, you know, the bottom line of their business.
And thank you for all those thoughts, because creating environments in which autistic people could thrive in the workplace and other people could thrive is something that is very dear to me. That's what a lot of my writing is all about. So there are definitely many ways in which neurodiversity can improve workplaces for all, productivity for all, and really be a major driving factor, especially because we're not solving the same problems with the same methods anymore. We need to come up with something that requires different perspectives and a different kind of thinking. Now, I do see a question in the chat about autistic industrial complex. I believe it refers to a book, Autism Industrial Complex, which I think talks about all those cure services, if I remember correctly. So I think that's another way that people have been using the term advantage, but that's the whole industry that kind of tries to provide services, sometimes support, and sometimes services that could be of different quality. So I believe the idea of autism industrial complex comes from this specific book. If anyone has anything to contribute on that. But yeah, so I think that's where that term comes from. And when we're talking about various ways in which we are dealing with human differences and neurodiversity and perceptions of the world, sometimes people say, well, in that generation it was different, but now we have completely new approach to something. So there are some ways in which younger millennials and Gen Zs are probably much more likely to have destigmatizing view on neurodiversity. But I want to know, what do you think about this? Does neurodiversity advantage mean something different for younger generations? And let's see, Reuben, would you like to start on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because it definitely feels more taboo for like older generations. So I just for context, like I have a lot of friends that are neurodiverse, and you know it's not like it really been a conscious decision. I think it's just the awareness seems to be like a lot more higher and broader, and a lot of these like neurodiverse friends are like incredibly creative people, and many of them run businesses as well. So I think that I don't know. I think that there's something to do with how like things are definitely moving in the right direction, and I feel like for whatever reason, like the Gen Z generation is maybe like a little more introspective in that. Like these kinds of topics do seem to be spoken about in more like open settings, and I think that kind of that kind of breakdown of the stigma around neurodiversity just allows people to it just made me think that there's a whole part of TikTok which is just like around autism awareness, and I think that because there is that type of content, and maybe there are negatives to it as well, but I think on the whole it's like it makes people like digest content in a way which is like really relatable. So there is small little things where it's like kind of like a TikTok around how an autistic person would like to like wear clothing, and like how like a hoodie with like a really loose cuff, like autistic people like don't like it, but if it was like tighter like that, like people find it much more comforting, and you just see like that sort of content will like have millions of views on it. And I think that that's kind of it's just like an interesting way of like storytelling, and for people to kind of empathize with the types of things that like autistic people might struggle with.
So, and that is fascinating because it sounds like even in your business, it's very relevant to get some of this information. But do you think TikTok and maybe other similar platforms, but TikTok specifically, is something that's shaping culture to a very significant extent, especially among younger generations, and specifically with regard to things like mental health, neurodiversity, and the wider discussion on those topics?
Yeah, massively. Yeah, it's just, I think that just everyone has a voice. We kind of, Gen Z all grew up with social media, so I think we're much more empowered to tell our stories and be creative in the way that we're doing it. For me, it's kind of been a lot more about self-expression through art and fashion, but I think for other people, like that's probably quite like an extreme way of like a medium, which is maybe not as instant as like making like a TikTok. So that works for me, but I think that it just helps with like accessibility and kind of like sharing just everyone has the tool to share a unique perspective, which is, I think, an amazing thing.
Yes, absolutely. And again, there are different tools in different generations. And I love LinkedIn, for example. That's a different way of communicating, different medium. But obviously, when you have TikTok, when it's mostly video-based platform, you do get a different way of interacting and somewhat of a different way of storytelling because the medium is different, and maybe a lot more emotion can be transmitted sometimes through this particular medium. But also I want to hear Lara's perspective on interaction of age and neurodiversity.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with Reuben. I work with young people. I've been a teacher for 28 years. So the range from 15 to 20 and 30, I've seen, each year's version of that. And I do believe that we are approaching a place where young people are absolutely more accepting, more open. In Reuben's words, everyone has a voice. They're open to expressing it, but they're also open to listening. And I'm very hopeful that things are changing for these younger people, and that younger people who are neurodivergent, their experience can be a much less painful one. But that's where we flip the coin. And I think for older autistics, Reuben had mentioned that, it's still a little bit taboo. It's not people around us that are our peers, our generation, are not as open-minded. And from all this sort of excitement and hope, it seems that those of us, let's say over 40 years old, are maybe a little bit left out of that. And what we are left with is not, personally, it's not as much my experience, but, and that's partly why I'm hoping to make a difference. But I can feel, and I hear people's resentment and frustration at being autistic and older, and having been treated, even if they were diagnosed young or if they had no clue about their autism, a lifetime of mistreatment, a lifetime of trauma that builds. It really builds. And I think that in other people, this becomes kind of a learned withdrawal to avoid the pain. And that certainly is dangerous for the individual. It's not helpful for society. It doesn't allow all of the gifts that a different perspective could bring to even come to the surface. So the trauma I mentioned, and I have something written here in my notes, which is I'm unhappy to say, but I think that a large segment of the adult over 40 autistic population, honestly, is a bit broken. And I think hopefully maybe there's room for that healing to take place, but it would need to happen. I am encouraged and hopeful for the younger generation that their experiences can have less of that pain.
I just absolutely hear you, Lara, and I sometimes also hear it as absolute desperation that is specific to the workplace. So you have a lifetime of interpersonal trauma, of being possibly treated poorly by your family, by random people on the street who for some reason decided that they didn't like whatever you were doing. But then specifically in the workplace, again, I would consider myself those who are successfully kind of navigated my neurodiversity in the workplace. But there are so many people who never had opportunities, who couldn't quite figure out why they're getting this feedback, like do different things, and nobody ever explained them what different things they wanted from them. And occupationally, they were kind of trying for a very long time to find their place, and then they find themselves in this double whammy that the ageism hits. And lots of autism employment programs and neurodiversity employment programs, which is kind of a neurodevelopment, are still for entry-level young people. So it's like, if you haven't made it and if you struggled, okay, well, tough. We're going to just kind of focus on this young creative talent. But you know what? If you're old, another stereotype that autistic people specifically are only good for tech jobs, but old people can't do tech jobs. And I'm intentionally using the terms that I would use otherwise. But the stereotypes are definitely not pretty, and they're not helping in the workplace, because then you end up hit by both neurodiversity stereotypes and age stereotypes. In case of older people, even though among younger people they can say, oh, they're neurodivergent and they're creative and they're young. Well, that kind of works. And again, exaggerating, because in some areas you still will not get even that kind of advantage at any age. But there are kinds of people that, let's say, well, you're too old to get into tech, and you're too old to do basically anything, that get hit by multiple stereotypes. What do you think we can do to really address this long-standing injustice, or how can we try to change stereotypes together? Reuben, would you start?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it does come down to the hiring process. So, there's just so much bias within how somebody identifies what is talent. And for example, yeah, I think that's kind of, I think educating people on how you can make a more inclusive hiring process is like a really good way to start. And I guess like an example would be, yeah, like autistic people do struggle with communication. So yeah, of course, that is a fundamental role to being part of a team. So it's kind of like, if your process is so heavily based on how somebody communicates, then it's very rare that you're going to choose an autistic person that might, whether it's like there'll be periods of maybe like awkward silence, or maybe even like myself, it's just like there are times where it's just really difficult for me to express what I know is in my head. So I think that I think a good way to kind of like get around that is like providing options, right? So whether it's say if you're screening somebody, it could be, well, I guess like for me personally, it's like I will always want to see the person in front of me, and I will always want to see that person's body language, because I will really struggle to understand what's going on if somebody is screening me just over the phone. So I guess like those types of things, just kind of, if I could, and it'll be different for every kind of person, but I think that if you have a variety of like formats of like assessing somebody, it will just like allow the person that's applying the ability to play into their strengths, rather than kind of being assessed in the same way that everybody else is. And I think that that's the challenge, right? Is because the reason why that happens is that like businesses want to be efficient as possible, but sometimes like that that one size fits all approach doesn't necessarily give you like outsized kind of like results. So if you can tailor and be a bit more creative with your hiring process, you might spot somebody that is exceptionally talented in the area that you really need. So I think, you know, it's a difficult, basically we're asking for businesses to just put more empathy and time into the way that they kind of identify talent.
Absolutely. And again, a lot of my work in this area. And as you said, it's very important to look at the individual, to allow individual to work with their strengths. But also very often companies hire in the same way, regardless whether they're hiring a model or an accountant, which doesn't make any sense. In one case, you do want to look at body language, for example. In the other case, who cares what is accountant's body language? But organizations still have the same interviews, the same kind of personality-based questions that for many jobs have nothing to do with anything. So making hiring process more valid specifically for roles and jobs that we're hiring could really make a tremendous difference, rather than saying, well, everyone needs to be able to show this perky personality for no reason, whether or not it actually is relevant to what they're doing. And then allowing people to work in different ways too, because some jobs require being in person, some jobs don't. Let's have flexibility in that as well. So thank you so much. And again, I hope young entrepreneurs like you can be tremendous examples to other people in that. And Lara, you probably have a lot to contribute to that question.
I have a heck of a lot to contribute to that conversation and to extend it, because Reuben focused a lot, rightly so, on the hiring process. But I'd like to talk about the workplace environment and community once the autistic employees have entered it. And I really think that we must alter the perception that, you know, the whole neurodiversity movement is underpinned with the belief that there is no one right way of thinking. There is no one right way of communicating. And for nothing to change and autistics to simply, for companies to fit them in where it's convenient isn't what it's all about. People need to meet in the middle. It shouldn't continue to be that people with autism would need to for instance, learn to fit in, or the company needs to find a way to fit them in. I think there needs to be grand changes in how we are interpreting and carrying out integration. I want to read a comment on one of my posts, which was about communication. And somebody said that what we should do is empower autistic people with communication skills instead of asking for special treatment. So autism inherently causes those with autism to communicate in a different way. So we don't need to become something we're not. We would not be able to. If autistic people and non-autistic people didn't communicate differently, there would not be autism. So the idea that I think educating the neurotypical community about what these communication differences might be. For example, Reuben saying that it's going to be a help to the conversation if you're in person. If the email, if somebody is right down the hall as someone who has autism, an autistic person, it's going to be helpful to their understanding to be in front. That and 27 other basic facts that then neurotypical employees can use to mutually meet each other in the middle. And certainly it's not the case that the autistic employees are not going to also be adapting. We adapt all the time. But if the different ways that we communicate can be something that employers better inform their majority employees about, then everyone's going to benefit. Our messages will be heard. What we have to offer will be heard, and the value will increase. So I think changing hiring practices is one thing, but there needs to be a lot of change once the employees are part of the organization, and not, again, not having it be perceived that the autistic people are worse at communicating, and instead have it be valued that there are differences. And here's a few small things we can do, like have in-person conversations that are going to help the bottom line for everyone.
Point about flexibility overall in how work is organized. There is no reason to insist on just one way of communicating for everyone. Some people are better at speaking, other people are better at writing. Why not provide us multiple ways of communicating? There are differences between introverts and extroverts, and different autistic people communicate differently, and then some people are dyslexic, and there's all kinds of differences. And yes, it can be difficult, but there's so much helpful technology now that even translates for us from medium to medium, that we really do not have any kind of justification for forcing people to do something that doesn't work with their wiring, that takes so much energy out of them to just conform and fit in, that they can't actually focus on what they need to be doing. And unfortunately, I believe we only have 4 minutes left. Please correct me in the chat if I'm wrong, but I believe we have 4 minutes left. So I just want to hear from both of you, what is your passion message in how we can create a better world for neurodivergent people and really create this future of work that is going to bring out all of our talents? Lara, you're unmuted, so I'll let you go first.
Okay.
And then you can unmute.
Well, I think that a positive outlook on everyone's part, not an us and them, a real cooperative spirit that recognizes the value that neurodivergent people offer, the neurodivergent advantage in the purest sense, as I said that I prefer to interpret it, with open minds, with education. I am very optimistic that things are improving and will continue to improve. But I do think that there are both those taboos and then maybe a little bit of stubbornness from, for instance, the person who says that autistic people simply need to be taught to communicate better. So I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful. And I think that there are a lot of us who are working hard. And I think that there's going to be plenty of neurotypical people who join our ranks and are all pushing for the same goals.
And now, Reuben, your last couple of minutes, bring us home.
Yeah, I think it. What I'd just love to see more of is just empowerment, and so like neurotypical people, empowering neurodiverse people, and kind of, I think that something I haven't really had enough time to like highlight is, you know, the talents and you know, the unique abilities that neurodiverse people do bring. And I think that in some ways it's really difficult for us to come to the forefront without, you know, the help and support of other people. So I think, yeah, with there being more understanding and empathy, I think that really that should help people to just, I think something, even being like a business owner, I kind of, you know, I don't, although we have neurodivergent people in the business, it's not, I don't like, you know, kind of segment, you know, okay, neurodiverse, neurotypical. It's like the way that we develop people is very much what is your unique talent. And I think the amazing thing about neurodivergent people and maybe specifically related to autism is that they will probably know what their passion and their talent is, because they will be hyper focused on that thing. So if you can spot that and identify that and provide them with the resources, then I like 100% they will excel. So I think it's really just like having that approach to really, you know, wanting to empathize with, you know, people as a whole, and then just like really understanding, you know, what it takes to help that person succeed.
Thank you. I absolutely love it, and I would love to talk to you for another 3 hours, but I do believe we are out of time. So thank you so much. Love learning from you, and let's hope we can continue this conversation, because there is so much more that we can do to create a better future of work for neurodivergent people and for everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you so much.
Hi, DIFESTers. My name is Reuben Vincent, and I am the founder of DIFEST Global. A warm welcome to you all on the third edition. This year, DIFEST will focus on the future of work by addressing authenticity, belongingness, and social impact as some of the most important practices for building a more inclusive and purpose driven workforce for everyone to thrive. Before we begin, I would like to humbly thank our belonging partner Newsela for supporting our initiative in democratizing world class content and promoting equity in education. On this note, I would like to welcome you to our session on how racial microaggressions impact mental health. Our moderator for today is the Managing Director of Employer Services for National Organization on Disability. She brings over 20 years of experience making the connection for businesses to the untapped talent pool of people with disabilities. More importantly, she has experienced the value of disability inclusion in her own business and through her work in the staffing industry, created talent acquisition programs dedicated to mitigating talent gaps while increasing integrated competitive employment opportunities for people with disabilities. Please welcome Felicia Nurmsen.
Thank you so much, Rudolph. I appreciate that introduction. It really is my pleasure to be here today, and my pleasure to be here with Dr. Torino. I'm going to go ahead and do a brief introduction for her as well. And Dr. Torino received her doctorate in counseling psychology from Columbia University in 2009. She has authored numerous scholarly articles, book chapters, and peer-reviewed publications on the teaching strategies used to cultivate culturally competent clinicians, processes of white racial identity development, and the manifestation and impact of microaggressions. Her co-edited book, Microaggression Theory, Influence and Implications, presents cutting-edge reviews of microaggression research, explores controversies surrounding the theory, discusses its relationship to the sociopolitical dynamics of society, and offers solutions in combating microaggressions at the individual, institutional, and societal levels. She has conducted numerous diversity training workshops within the fields of higher education, nursing, mental health, medicine, emergency management, business, and K-12 education. Dr. Torino currently serves as interim dean of the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at SUNY Empire State College. Moreover, she is a board member of the RAND Corporation Center to Advance Racial Equality and Equity Policy. Finally, she is a licensed psychologist and has a private practice in Westchester County, New York. For more information, you can visit her website at ginatorino.com. So thank you so much, Gina, for being here with us today. I'm excited to have this discussion.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here.
We have a lot to cover during our time together. So first, would you provide a bit of background on the history of the term microaggressions and how they manifest in the workplace?
Sure. Well, thank you again. I'm so grateful to be here and to be able to talk about microaggressions. I've been doing this work now for, I don't know, quite some time, almost 20 years. If I date myself, but the term microaggressions was initially coined by Dr. Chester Pierce. He was an African-American psychiatrist from Harvard, and he did some of the earliest work looking at African Americans' depictions in television commercials. So that was kind of his first area of research. And he initially coined that term in the 70s. But since then, not a lot of work had been done on it until the late 90s and early 2000s. Solorzano and colleagues did some work in microaggressions in higher education. And, essentially the whole kind of background of microaggressions is at least in the United States, and I know elsewhere in the world, racism exists, sexism exists, and it used to be more overt. But in the United States, since the civil rights movement, we've seen kind of bias kind of go a little bit more underground, so to speak, not as overt. But more recently, as we've seen in the United States, at least, some of the some implicit bias come out in our culture, with respect to George Floyd and police shootings. So the notion of bias never went away. It's not that, because of what happened in the civil rights movement, people stopped being racist, for example. It just kind of manifested a bit differently. So my research team in graduate school at Columbia University, we were doing some work and published a paper in 2007 called Racial Microaggressions in Everyday Life, Implications for Clinical Practice. And in that piece, what we did is we looked at the literature and created themes of different types of microaggressions that we found existed. And really what microaggressions are, they are derogatory slights or insults directed towards a target person or group. And typically that person has marginalized identities, whether that's with respect to race, gender, ability, sexual identity, and social class, and so on. And microaggressions can be delivered in a host of ways, either behaviorally, verbally, environmentally. Oftentimes they are unconscious, but not always. And they're not just mistakes. They come from our own implicit biases. And we all have biases, whether we like it or not. And these biases are often rooted in stereotypes we have about different people. So, the examples of the microaggressions are, you can look in the literature, there's so many of them. So something more subtle, like telling for example, if I was at work and I told a Black colleague, "Oh, you're so articulate." So what am I saying there? I'm saying I'm intending, right, to maybe give somebody a compliment. However, what the message is that, "Oh, I'm surprised that somebody from your racial group is smart." Another type of microaggression, overlooking somebody at a meeting, not listening to them, right? So that's a very subtle kind of thing. So if there's a woman who's talking, I just don't listen to her, or I may actually take her idea, at a meeting during work. So that would be an example of a microaggression. Again, it's not so overt. It's much more subtle. And there's so many, examples that I can give, saying someone, "Oh, can I touch your hair?" That, like, okay, maybe you're intending to say, okay, I really like it, but you're exoticizing that person. Or maybe asking an Asian colleague, say, "Oh, could you help me with this math problem?" And not because that the person has a skill in math, it's maybe because they're Asian and the assumption is that they're good at math. So those are just some examples of some of the microaggressions that can manifest in the workplace and actually abound quite a bit. Again, we may not even be aware that we are committing these microaggressions because they're so subtle. And because the person may not say anything, we don't maybe even understand, what we're doing. So I think really the goal here is to raise awareness of our own biases. And there's lots of different ways to do that. And I can talk about that a little bit later if you want as well.
To come off mute. So that would be fantastic. I know the one thing that we do want to talk about, I would love to hear more about that as well. But could you talk just a little bit about the cumulative effect, right? That all of these microaggressions that, but as you said, you may not be aware of them as it's happening, but how does it relate to mental health, physical health, and then workplace behaviors?
Yeah, the cumulative and insidious impact of microaggressions are great. They're often described as death by 1,000 cuts. So it may seem, innocuous. Well, okay, so what if someone, says that I'm articulate? It's the daily, everyday kind of thing we're talking about here. It's not like it's not a one-time thing. It happens all the time. And so that can really drain a person. It really saps somebody's energy having to, explain to people like this isn't okay, or, you might not want to do that. It's a lot of work while the person has work to do. So they're kind of fending off these microaggressions while they have some work to do. Another thing that is really can be draining to people is the ambiguity of some microaggressions. Like I talked about, sometimes people would be ignored during a meeting or overlooked. How do you know that's based on race or gender or sexual identity? You don't really know, but you notice it happens to you a lot. And you talk about it with your colleagues, maybe from the same group, and they're like, yeah, that happens to me too. So you're thinking, well, maybe it is, but I don't know. And that kind of ambiguity leaves people feeling like, am I crazy here or what? You know, they're not, but it can leave somebody feeling that way because they're not validated by maybe their manager or somebody else at work. And you know, we don't want to create a culture within our work environments that microaggressions are okay or they're normal or expected, because that can reinforce inequities. You know, really, the cumulative impact of microaggressions can really serve as a threat to one's identity within an organization. And the literature that's been emerging, I would say over the last like maybe 10 years or so, is really pointing to the connection and correlation between the incidence of perceived microaggressions and things like depression, anxiety, something that's newer to the literature called race-based traumatic stress, which is really analogous to something like a PTSD, where somebody can be experiencing like a hypervigilance and really concern, and especially if they've experienced microaggressions at work. And I actually had an opportunity to work on a case where this actually happened to somebody. I was an expert witness on a case, and this person experienced microaggressions, and the person you know, was eventually fired, but then they came back to the site once in a while, and she had experienced something like a PTSD from seeing this person there. So that can really happen to people. Also, you know, things like, you know, suicidal ideation too. That's, you know, really unfortunate. And really, microaggressions really lead to cultural mistrust. Like if you are committing microaggressions pretty regularly in the workplace, how can I really trust you? And if I can't trust a colleague or a coworker, how am I going to be productive, right? How am I going to actually do the work that I need to do and produce? So that's a real problem as well. But in addition to some of the psychological impacts, there are also physical impacts. You know, we're finding that microaggressions correlate with poor physical morbidity, increased alcohol use, increased cortisol level, which is like the stress hormone, you know, reduced medication compliance and things of that nature. And with respect to the workplace, I mean, what we're finding too is that people who experience microaggressions on a pretty daily basis report like decreases in job satisfaction, lower organizational commitment, negative impact on job performance, and higher rates of attrition. So if, you know, people may think, well, okay, well, you know, again, like, what does it really matter if these microaggressions are happening? Well, it does matter, because in the workplace, you know, if you're looking at these issues that are happening, people are leaving the organization, you're really not, your money is not going very far, because, you know, in organizations, you know, as we know, we spend money on training, we spend money on hiring, we spend a lot of money and resources. And if we're not retaining talent, diverse talent, it's going to affect the bottom line. So I do think that this work, you know, obviously from my perspective, from a humanitarian perspective, it's important. And from a business perspective, it is important. So that's really what we're looking at here with respect to the cumulative impact of microaggressions.
You know, it's just amazing when you think about all of the things that we really do need to consider in the workplace. And how do we help organizations, right? What kind of interventions can organizations and individuals maybe practice or provide in order to mitigate some of these effects? Obviously, you know, we want to do everything that we possibly can, but thinking about all of the other issues, microaggressions really are part of those issues, but we're kind of separating them out, but it's part of the whole cultural experience for our employees.
That's correct. And, you know, one of the things, you know, that I would recommend, you know, with respect to organizations, well, one, it's, you know, it's my hope that all organizations would have in some capacity, I mean, depending on how large they are, would have some DEI and leadership and positions, upper management, administration, you know, whatever type of organization you're in, there would be somebody there to kind of oversee this work within an organization. And then two, to understand microaggressions within an organization, you have to have an assessment. There is this one company, actually they're based in the UK, called Inchorus. They have a software program that people could, use like on a subscription basis, and they will actually do an assessment of the types of microaggressions, the frequency, so it's a really good organization. So that's another thing. I mean, if you use that, or you even create your own survey, obviously anonymous, because people may not want to, talk about them, or, disclose, have them be identified with a particular person. So it's important to maintain that anonymity if you're trying to get an understanding. So you have to understand what's going on. Another piece I think organizations could really, take to heart is when you're onboarding new employees, you can include some implicit bias and microaggression training. That's a good opportunity to say, hey, as you begin this work here, we want you to understand what implicit bias is. We want you to understand your own biases. We want to help you understand what microaggressions are and how they could potentially manifest in the workplace, and to kind of give some kind of talk, like similar to what I'm doing now, maybe in more depth and more detail, obviously, but that would be excellent. Also, training hiring committees and management to understand and prevent implicit bias in hiring and promotion. So not only, do we do it with the new employees, but when we're hiring people, there can be bias through the hiring practice or promotion. How are we promoting people within this organization? Making cultural competency maybe part of one of the competencies that every employee would have to demonstrate that they're adept at in order to progress in an organization. Bringing in guest speakers to discuss topics related to implicit bias and microaggressions are important. Implementing employee resource groups, so groups that are kind of formed within the organization that provide some training, that provide resources, provide readings, provide support for people within an organization. Those are really important as well. I think that, with respect to microaggressions as they occur in an organization, because I think it's important too to understand, like, okay, well, what if I'm in an organization and I do commit a microaggression? Like, what do I say? Because we all make mistakes. We're human beings, and it's not avoiding the mistakes that is the issue. It's how do you respond to somebody who may confront you on something, right? So if I commit a microaggression, to somebody, they might be like, I'd be like, oh, well, can you help me with this math problem? They say, well, not all Asians are good at math, and that. Oh, I'm sorry. Was that offensive? Yes, it was. Oh, okay. I'm very sorry. I wasn't aware. Thank you for telling me that. So it's important to acknowledge that you did make a mistake. Don't get defensive, because if you get defensive, that's just going to break down trust and communication with that person, the fellow employee. And take responsibility for yourself, for learning more and more about yourself, so that you can prevent these microaggressions from happening. Will we as human beings be able to excise all of our bias? No, but we can work on it. We can become better. We can always strive to become better, and that's what I think is most important. And some people say, well, I'm afraid to open my mouth now. Oh, I just heard you talk, and now I don't want to say anything. No, that's not the point. The point is to say things and then be open to what you might hear back from that person. So not to shut down. And I don't want people to get shut down, because, when we talk about bias, particularly, with respect to racism, can feel like, oh, I'm afraid. It's not the fear, it's the overcoming that and being able to step out and make mistakes. We're all human beings, and that's true. So I want to make sure that I convey that here today with you.
Absolutely. And everything that you just said are things that we are talking about at the National Organization on Disability as it relates to people with disabilities as well, right? So ensuring about your implicit bias, right?
Yes.
Making sure that we are looking at people with disabilities as far as the entire employee life cycle is concerned, right?
Yes.
Because retention starts at the application process. And that's
correct.
right. Just what you're saying. Make sure that this education is happening during the onboarding process, and that we continue to provide that professional development for our existing employees to ensure that we continue to either mitigate that, as well as ensure that we're creating opportunities for
That's
people.
correct. That's
So
right. That's really
thank you for
important.
that.
Sure. Yep.
Now, one last, I know we've got, well, we actually have 10 minutes left. So I really would love for you to talk about prevention,
Mhm.
right? What can we do potentially to prevent this moving forward? We've talked a little bit about what's currently happening, but thinking about really what can we put in place as that foundation in order to prevent it in the future?
Yeah, I think, in order to prevent microaggressions, I really think that what's so important is for people and organizations to make this commitment to become you can feel them anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-ableist. Like we have to make it that commitment. And then once that commitment is made, it's really, it really does take work. So when I say work, I mean, it takes this kind of inner work to develop a certain level of self-awareness, and it does require being a little uncomfortable in order to learn. I think all learning happens and growth happens through some discomfort. So it's really taking on opportunities. There are organizations that provide anti-racist workshops, and I could list a bunch of different ones, but the Center for White American Culture. There's, to understand one's own biases, I think will help prevent the incidence of microaggressions. But I think it really requires somebody saying to themselves, like, yes, I'm going to make this commitment to do this work. I'm going to seek out opportunities. Another one, online training that somebody could do is the implicit association test. I don't know if you've heard of that, but that's out of Harvard, and anybody could take that online. You can do it from your home, and it really kind of gives you a sense of, and then again, there's some controversy about the research, but I think overall it's a good kind of starting place for people to kind of say, okay, what are some of my biases? I may think I'm not biased, but maybe I am. And so really just developing that, I think, self-awareness of your own biases can help you then prevent them from manifesting in the workplace, with your friends and your family, and as a person in general, because we have a lot of context that we live in. We're not just at work, but so I really think developing that self-awareness is key. And if there aren't opportunities for you to develop that in your workplace, it's really incumbent on people to do that on their own. Doing some reading, maybe just to start off doing some reading. There's a good book called A Blind Spot by Banaji. There's White Fragility. That's another good book. Becoming Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. Again, my specialty is race, so I do have a lot of those books like on the top of my head. My colleague wrote a book called That's So Gay, and that's out through the American Psychological Association. So even just doing some reading, that'll just kind of get you into the frame to say, okay, wow, I didn't realize that these could be microaggressions, and maybe I've said this to somebody, or just asking somebody, how's your wife? Well, I'm gay and I have a husband. Like, okay, well, okay. So sorry. Like, like just even little subtle things like that. Like, okay, yeah, that heteronormative. Okay. I got that. Like, it's just, important to just even start some reading. So reading, developing self-awareness, going to workshops, doing that training, I think, and getting out into the world, sometimes we learn by doing. So when we're out there, and again, if we do receive some feedback, listen to that feedback, and then that will prevent you from doing it again in the future. We're always learning and growing as human beings. So I want to say that too.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. But what do you say to the detractors, right? To those people and those organizations that will say, well, if our people aren't recognizing them as microaggressions, then why do we have to do anything about it? Why would we do any work on this?
Well, they may not be saying it because maybe, and some people are reluctant to speak up because of fear, fear of how this will impact their performance, and, will it impact their ability to get a raise or to progress in an organization? So, they may be saying they're not experiencing it, but maybe they are. And so you don't really know. And sometimes, microaggressions can occur out of a person's awareness. And so maybe they're not impacting them, but oftentimes people are aware of them. And again, whether or not they say it, that's another piece. And I think, there has to be some judgment and sensitivity, I think, given towards people and their real experiences. I work, in my capacity as dean. I'm on a climate committee at the university where I am, and people have reported in the organization, anonymously, all these microaggressions. And you would go to work, you would say, what microaggressions? Oh, not me. But they're there. They just, you may not hear about them. So that's why it's really important to understand your organization, and either on your own with a consultation or through an organization, to really develop some system of understanding what is going on in your organization. Because I can guarantee everyone who's listening in every organization that people belong to, they're happening and they are having an impact. You're just not aware of it. It's because people fear talking about bias. And I think what's really important for people to understand is that working through that fear and just talking, being explicit about what's going on is so key, because they're there. And so you're just ignoring a problem. It's like, what is that phrase? Elephant in the room or something?
Let's introduce the elephant in the room.
Yeah. Like, it's happening. It's in the room, but you're not talking about it. It's just going to get bigger and bigger. And, like you said before, like these microaggressions are happening and they're impacting people. Like somebody leaves your organization, you don't know why they're leaving. They may not even say it in their exit interview, but that's what's happened to them, unfortunately. And then you don't get feedback from people. So it's really important. And it has to be like a proactive kind of approach, I think. If any leadership here is listening, and any guidance I could give is just to really be proactive and say, hey, we want to get a better understanding of what's going on here. So help us understand. Have you ever had these experiences? If so, tell us about it. How frequently? How has it impacted you? We want to help. We want to help, ameliorate these as much as possible. Like I said, it may not happen overnight, and you may not completely eradicate them, but you can do your best to work on, minimizing their impact in the workplace.
Absolutely. Well, I want to see if there are any questions. I think that Sean is with us to see if we have any audience questions.
No audience questions so far. It's okay.
Okay. All right. Wow.
That's okay.
That means that you're doing a great job.
Yes, I don't know. Not sure what it means. Okay, that's fine. We're okay with that.
Absolutely.
But I really appreciate this time and this opportunity, because there has been a backlash, I think, against microaggressions, and saying, oh, you're making a big deal out of nothing. It's really, get over it. I've heard that before. People say that. And well, okay, get over it. But what about all this research that's come out that says, people are really impacted in a negative way? Like, who wants to be depressed and, because of this, or feel like they want to kill themselves? I mean, these are serious issues that are happening here. So I think that people who say those things, I don't think they understand the literature. They don't understand what the research has been saying and how important it is, because we know as people within organizations, and if you do any kind of management, that emotions are important and people's feelings are important, and attending to those within an organization is the key to being productive. And, if people feel satisfied, if they feel like they can trust people, they're going to feel more secure in their job, and they're just going to be more productive. So it really does impact the bottom line. And, it's just such an important topic. So I really appreciate being invited here, and be happy to answer questions. Or if anyone wants to follow up with me, please feel free to reach out to me through my website. I'm happy to help in whatever way that I can.
Well, I know that as I said, I was so happy to be a part of this session. I did expressly request this because it is something that I think it's so important, Dr. Torino, and the work that you're doing. I know that you are doing a lot of training. I certainly would hope to see more of that, and especially as it relates to mental health in the workplace.
Sure.
We know that is such a huge issue right now, and it continues to grow. So would love to see that. And I don't think that, I think microaggressions might have a little bit to do with the Great Resignation, with quiet quitting, you know, all of those things when we're dissatisfied. And what is how has that happened, right? What has affected people?
And you're right. There was a recent article in the New York Times, I think, talked about how people of color who were working at home felt much better working at home because they didn't have to deal with the in-person microaggressions and, you know, or being excluded from events, or, you know, being touched, or, you know, like they felt like, oh, even though they did experience some microaggressions online, it was a lot less than, and now some of the anxiety about going back into the workplace. There's articles out there. People can read them. They're there. So it is a big issue. So thank you so much for
thank you. This was fantastic. The time flew by. So great to be here with you. Really, again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.